Isaac Newton's third law of motion states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Now, in geopolitics, the situation is more complicated. There are not these kinds of simple laws of nature like in physics. And the reality is that often when a powerful country attacks a weaker country, the weaker country cannot respond proportionately because it simply isn't strong enough. And this has largely been true in the past few decades, when the United States was the most powerful country on Earth, and the US was interfering in the internal affairs of countries all around the world, carrying out coups and regime change operations, invading foreign countries, imposing sanctions. And most nations were not powerful enough to respond with an equal and opposite reaction. However, in the past few years, the geopolitical order has been shifting in some profound ways. And what we're seeing is that the US empire overextended itself. And the more that the US attacks and lashes out against foreign countries, in reality, what's happening is that the US is in fact accelerating the transition to a more multipolar world. And more countries are seeking alternatives to US political and economic dominance. And today I'm going to be talking about how the US empire's strategy of divide and conquer has completely failed. And by attacking China and Russia and Iran and even India all at the same time, what the US government has done is the US has helped to unite China, India, Russia, and Iran. These four large countries are part of a very important organization that is not very well known in the West. It is called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. And this September 2025, these large Eurasian countries gathered together in the Chinese city of Tianjin to hold a historic SCO summit, in which they pledged to deepen their cooperation and build a more multipolar world. Today I'm going to analyze the most important outcomes of this historic meeting, which is a perfect example of how the more the US government attacks other countries around the world, the more it incentivizes them to build a new kind of global order, one in which the US is no longer the global hegemon. So in short, what we're talking about increasingly is a post-US global order. And one of the clearest examples of this is how Donald Trump, the US president, has been attacking India, threatening massive tariffs on India. And what this has actually done is it has pushed India closer to China. And at this Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, China and India significantly improved their relations. So the US government's attacks have really backfired. China and India have long had very complex, antagonistic relations, but now they're moving together, and Russia is a close partner of both China and India. So these three massive countries in Eurasia have been moving closer and closer together, and the US strategy to divide them has utterly failed. Now, that was perhaps the most important outcome of the SCO summit, but it wasn't the only one. Another significant announcement is that China's President Xi Jinping proposed the creation of an SCO development bank, and the members of the organization voted to approve this proposal. They are going to create a new development bank that is focused on lending in local currencies. Because that was another crucial issue that was discussed at the summit, which is de-dollarization. SCO countries have already pledged in past meetings to deepen their trade and to use local currencies, not the US dollar. And Iran's president also spoke at the SCO summit, and he gave a speech calling for strengthening the move toward de-dollarization, and he made several concrete proposals for these Eurasian countries to use other currencies to move away from the US dollar. Later, I'll talk about this in greater detail. And there was another very important outcome of this SCO summit, which, by the way, was the largest SCO summit ever held. And that was that China's President Xi announced the creation of a global governance initiative to complement the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Security Initiative that have already been launched by China. The goal of this new initiative is to transform global institutions to create a more multipolar order in which the majority of countries on Earth, the global South countries, have an equal voice, not just the colonizing powers of the West. And I'm going to quote here from the readout that was published by the Chinese government, explaining how Beijing sees this proposal for the Global Governance Initiative. It noted that in his remarks at the summit, President Xi warned that, quote, the Cold War mentality, hegemonism, and protectionism continue to haunt the world, end quote. He added, quote, global governance has come to a new crossroads, end quote. So what China wants to do is bring countries together to create a new global order. And what would that look like? President Xi said that, quote, all countries, regardless of size, strength, and wealth, are equal participants, decision makers, and beneficiaries in global governance. There should be no double standards, and the house rules of a few countries must not be imposed on others, end quote. So clearly what the Chinese leadership is saying here is that the US empire designed the global order after World War II to benefit the US at the expense of other countries. And Washington has imposed its so-called rules and standards on other nations. And China is saying we need to move to a new global order beyond US hegemony that is truly multipolar, that is truly democratic, in which all countries have equal representation and not just the US and its allies. This is precisely why the US empire is so afraid of the growing unity in the global South and in organizations like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is precisely why Washington has been desperate to try to divide China and India and to try to divide China and Russia, but the US is failing. And this is why US media outlets like the Associated Press are warning, this is a title of an AP article, quote, SCO Summit could challenge US dominance and lend weight to China's vision of a multipolar world, end quote. And I would add that this is not just China's vision. This is a vision that is shared by the majority of formerly colonized countries in the global South. They want a more multipolar world. They don't want to be dominated by the Western powers that colonized them. This is why there is so much interest in new global South-led organizations like BRICS, which now represents the majority of the global population. Every year, more and more countries apply to join BRICS. And as of July 2025, there are now 20 different countries officially in BRICS, including 10 members and 10 partners. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has a lot of overlap with BRICS. Many of the members of the SCO are also members of BRICS, but the SCO is actually a bit older. BRICS was formed in 2009 and has since expanded. The SCO was expanded back in 2001. And originally, the SCO was more focused on security issues, especially on combating extremist movements in Eurasia. And when the SCO was first founded in 2001, the original members were China and Russia, along with the Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And since then, it has expanded further, adding India and Pakistan, which is very impressive because India and Pakistan are rivals, but they're now part of the same organization. And then since then, it has further expanded, adding Iran and Belarus. The SCO also has a dozen dialogue partners, which are countries that are not officially members, but they often participate in SCO events. And this includes some major countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, as well as two countries that are now members of BRICS, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. So what this means is that the SCO represents more than 2/5 of the global population, including the two most populous countries on Earth, India and China, as well as other massive countries like Pakistan and Russia, which are among the top 10 most populous countries on Earth. And although the SCO was originally founded more as an organization focused on security, Increasingly, it is also focusing on other areas of cooperation, especially trade and investment and technology transfer and research and infrastructure development. And this is also very important because if you look at the top 5 largest economies on Earth, when you measure their GDPs at purchasing power parity, 3 of those 5 are members of both the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. The largest economy on Earth, when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity, is China, representing nearly 20% of the global economy. India is the 3rd largest economy at 8.5% of the global economy, and Russia is the 4th biggest economy, representing 3.5% of the global economy. So when you combine these 3 countries together, China, India, and Russia, they represent roughly 1/3 of the entire global economy and growing more and more over time. China and India are the fastest growing major economies on Earth. Given how powerful this Eurasian bloc could be if it united, one of the main strategies of the US empire for decades has been to try to divide Eurasia. So for instance, Washington has been very successful in dividing Europe from the rest of Eurasia. Europe now has very antagonistic relations with Russia. It's basically at war with Russia in Ukraine. And the US has also been pushing European leaders to cut off their ties to China. At the same time, the US government has been trying to divide China and Russia and China and India. And in recent years, the US government did have some success in growing closer and closer to India, especially after the rise of the new right-wing Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and US politicians boasted that Modi was the most pro-US leader in India's history. This was a bipartisan strategy under both Republicans and Democrats. So Barack Obama began to woo Modi when he became prime minister in 2014. Trump also significantly improved relations with India during his first term as president. And then when Joe Biden came in 2021, he also deepened U.S. ties to India. And in particular, Biden tried to strengthen the so-called Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which includes the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India. And together they were trying to make a bloc in what they call the Indo-Pacific region in order to counter and isolate China. Now, again, during his first term, Trump had participated in this divide and conquer strategy to try to divide China and India to isolate China. However, in his second term, Trump is most focused on trying to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with other countries. And Trump has complained that, as he wrote on his website Truth Social, India, quote, sells us massive amounts of goods, their biggest client, but we sell them very little. Until now, a totally one-sided relationship, and it has been for many decades, end quote. Now, Trump is, of course, exaggerating, but what he's really getting at here is the fact that India does have a large trade surplus with the U.S., and over time, that trade surplus has been increasing. So Trump wants to force India to buy more products from the United States. So how does he plan to do that? Well, Trump has been imposing massive tariffs on countries all around the world. And in fact, the 2 most heavily tariffed countries now are Brazil and India, which both face tariff rates, official tariff rates of 50%. Now, China also faces very high tariff rates, which are constantly in flux. At one point, they were over 150%. But it's not a coincidence that the countries facing the highest tariff rates from Trump are also important members of BRICS. Brazil is the B in BRICS. India is the I in BRICS. China is the C in BRICS. And Trump has made it very clear that he wants to break up BRICS because he sees BRICS as a threat to the global dominance of the US dollar. Now, the excuse that Trump has been using to try to justify imposing these massive tariffs is that supposedly he's doing it because India is buying large amounts of cheap Russian oil at a discount. But this is not because of Russian oil. That's simply Trump's excuse. What this is really about is Trump is using tariffs to pressure India in order to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with India. However, the more that Trump puts pressure on India, what he's actually doing is pushing India closer to China. And the US assumed for many years that India and China would always have very negative relations. For instance, in 2020, there were border clashes between India and China. And in Washington, politicians and media outlets have been exacerbating these tensions, trying to cause more conflict in between China and India. But what Trump is actually doing now is he's pushing India to improve its diplomatic relations with China. And what we've seen in 2024 and 2025 are several major diplomatic breakthroughs. And one of these was the historic trip that India's Prime Minister Modi took to China for this SCO summit in September. On Twitter, Modi posted photos of the leaders of India, China, and Russia having friendly conversations, all standing together at this summit. This was a very significant symbolic blow to Washington's divide and conquer efforts. After the SCO summit, Modi tweeted that his trip to China was very productive, and he said that he is, quote, thankful to President Xi Jinping, the Chinese government, and people for the successful organization of this summit, end quote. So that diplomatic statement was quite friendly. And the mainstream US media outlet Foreign Policy published an article noting how the SCO summit and how Modi's trip to China, his first trip since 2018, are signs that China and India may be moving toward a more coordinated foreign policy. Now, I'm going to read a few quotes from this article, but keep in mind that this was written by someone who works at Chatham House, which is a mainstream British think tank funded by the British government. So this is a very mainstream perspective. He noted that China and India have long maintained convergent worldviews. Both of them see themselves as civilizational states that have thousands of years of history. Both of them want to be leaders of the global south and, quote, both want a more equitable distribution of power in a multipolar global order, end quote. And these points are important to keep in mind because for years, very arrogant imperial strategists in Washington thought that they could simply use India as their pawn, as their puppet, to try to isolate China. But India is a massive country with its own interests. And I'm going to read here from this article in Foreign Policy magazine. Quote, it's time for the West to reassess its long-standing position of viewing India as a counterbalance to China. India was never going to be the bulwark against China that the West, and the United States in particular, thought it was. And Modi's China visit marks a potential turning point toward a more coordinated position between both countries on their foreign policies, end quote. This article also added, importantly, that what both China and India are seeking is strategic autonomy. They want to have their own independent foreign relations. They're not going to be bossed around by the US or any other country. The Hong Kong newspaper, the South China Morning Post, I think put it very well in an article titled, Sense of Urgency as SCO Powers Work to Resist Bullying from the West. Donald Trump thinks that he can just boss around all of these countries and use tariffs and sanctions, which are bipartisan. Also, Biden and Obama and George Bush, they all imposed more and more sanctions on countries around the world. So these countries are tired of being bullied by the US empire, and increasingly, they're coming together to create alternatives. At this SCO summit in Tianjin, Modi met with China's President Xi, and he referred to it as a, quote, fruitful meeting, end quote. And Modi said that there is, quote, positive momentum in India-China relations, end quote. And he emphasized, quote, the importance of maintaining peace and tranquility in border areas. And he said, quote, we agreed on the importance of maintaining peace and tranquility in border areas and reaffirmed our commitment to cooperation based on mutual respect, mutual interest, and mutual sensitivity, end quote. This is a very strong diplomatic statement after years of tensions. And in these remarks, the Indian Prime Minister pointed out that the last meeting between Modi and Xi was in Kazan. He was referring to the Russian city, Kazan, which hosted the BRICS summit in October 2024. And it's important to emphasize that Russia was hosting that BRICS summit because Russia has very close relations with both China and India, and Russian diplomats have played a key role in trying to bring together China and India. So while the US is trying to divide China and India, Russia is trying to unite them. And that 2024 BRICS summit was very historic. First of all, because it announced the expansion of BRICS, adding 10 new partner countries, but also because on the sidelines of the 2024 BRICS summit, China and India signed a historic agreement resolving their border dispute, which had remained unresolved since 2020. For 4 years, there were these very high levels of tensions. And further progress was made on this same border issue at the 2025 SCO summit in Tianjin. And President Xi made some remarkable comments in these meetings with Modi. He said, China and India should be friends. They should have good neighborly and amicable ties. They should be partners, not rivals. They should provide development opportunities, not threats. And then President Xi called to, quote, have the dragon and the elephant dance together, end quote. That is quite the image. The dragon and the elephant dancing together. That's how President Xi sees China's and India's relations in this new era. However, for the imperial strategists in Washington, when they saw these meetings, when they heard those speeches, they were obviously enraged. They were furious. And we could see this reflected in the interviews done by Trump's previous national security advisor and by Biden's national security advisor. So during his first term, Trump's national security advisor was the neoconservative war hawk John Bolton. And in an interview with the US media, Bolton was furious about the fact that China and India have grown closer together, and he said that Trump is making a huge mistake. Listen here.
All eyes on Shanghai at the moment, and in previous instances, this has been referred to as the League of Authoritarian Gentlemen or a dictator's club, but it's somewhat upended now, isn't it, when you see people like Narendra Modi attending too? What do you make of his attendance?
Well, there's a lot of bad news here, very little good news. The West has spent decades, U.S. in particular, trying to wean India away from its Cold War attachment to Soviet Union, Russia, buying sophisticated weapons from them. And cautioning India on the danger posed by China. This is symbolized by what's called the Asian Security Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. A lot of effort to make India more amenable to cooperation with these countries. Donald Trump in the past weeks has essentially upended that, and for a variety of reasons, now sent India back toward Russia to grow closer to China, and just shredding these decades of efforts to try and change that alignment. I'm not saying this can't be fixed, but it's going to take a lot of work, and I don't see it starting anytime soon.
6 months ago, we would have talked about the bromance between Donald Trump and Narendra Modi of India.
However, I should be clear, this is not just the view of some neoconservative hawks on the Republican Party, like John Bolton. This is shared by the neoconservative hawks in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden's national security advisor was Jake Sullivan, who was also the top advisor to another Democratic Party neoconservative war hawk, Hillary Clinton, when she was the Secretary of State in the Obama administration. So Jake Sullivan is a powerful voice in the Democratic Party, and he did an interview with the pro-war neoconservative U.S. media outlet Bulwark, in which he basically said the same thing, that the U.S. should be trying to divide China and India, but Trump is actually pushing them together. Listen here.
When I go to these places now, or I talk to leaders there, what they're talking about is de-risking from the United States. Yeah. They now see the U.S. as the big disruptor, the country that can't be counted on. And you see this show up in opinion polling now, public opinion polling globally. China has moved ahead of the United States in popularity in a whole lot of countries. And that was not the case 1 year ago, where countries now are basically, saying the U.S. brand is in the toilet and China is looking like, actually, in a bizarre way, a more responsible player. So that's one of the big things that I hear from my friends who continue to work in these governments in Europe, in Asia, Take a look at India as another example. I mean, here's a country that on a bipartisan basis, we were working to try to build a deeper and more sustainable relationship with. And the China challenge loomed large in that. Now you've got President Trump executing a massive trade offensive against them. And the Indians are saying, well, shit, I guess maybe we have to go show up in Beijing and sit with the Chinese because we got a hedge against America.
So you can see from those remarks that this divide and conquer strategy is bipartisan in Washington. Republicans and Democrats are both committed to the new Cold War of trying to isolate China. And yet Trump has been so aggressive, threatening so many countries, that this has actually helped China in many ways, because now China is seen more favorably around the world. And China has significantly improved its diplomatic relations with countries like India and even Japan and South Korea, these historic US allies. By the way, I should point out a little fun fact here. This is precisely why on social media platforms in China, people often make fun of Trump and they refer to him as Comrade Trump, who is building China. So Chuan Jianguo, Chuan is a way, Chuanpu is a way of saying Trump, and then Jianguo means to construct or to build the country. Jianguo was actually a popular name that was given to people in the Mao era when they were trying to build up their country after the end of the partial colonization in the century of humiliation. So this is a very patriotic name that they're sarcastically giving Trump. And sometimes as a joke, they even add comrade to the end. 同志. So what they're saying is that Trump is so bad at governing the US, he's doing so much damage to the US and its reputation around the world, that he's actually helping to build up China. And although I think that is basically true, at the same time, I always emphasize in my analyses here that this is not just about Donald Trump. Trump is an accelerant. Trump is accelerating trends that we've already seen for years, if not decades. The world has been becoming more and more multipolar for about 2 decades. In many ways, I think the peak of US unipolar dominance of the world, the most powerful moment for the US empire, was the 1990s and the early 2000s. But since at least 2008, the US empire has been in decline. Maybe you could say the point was 2003 with the illegal US invasion of Iraq, but 2008 with the financial crisis that started on Wall Street, it started in the US and spread to other countries. It was a clear sign to other nations around the world that the US-led hegemonic order, the US unipolar imperial order, was not an order based on peace and prosperity. It was based on war, like we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan and later Syria and Libya and Yemen and Palestine. Look what the US is doing to Gaza today. It's clear that the so-called Pax Americana was not actually peaceful. It was based on violence and war and hegemony. But also the 2008-2009 financial crisis was a wake-up call that this order was based on a massive financial bubble. We already saw the first bubble pop in the 2000 dot-com bubble. And then the 2008 financial crash was a massive wake-up call. And it's not a coincidence that in 2009, BRICS was formed. Originally, it was formed by Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These were the largest emerging market economies that wanted to create a new kind of international financial order. And then in 2010, South Africa joined. BRIC became BRICS. And since then, more and more countries have wanted to join. BRICS has expanded. It represents the majority of the global population and now nearly half of the world economy. And more countries, especially in the global south, want to create alternatives to the US-dominated international financial system. De-dollarization is growing. More and more countries are pushing for de-dollarization, alternatives to the US dollar. And this was an issue that was discussed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit held at the Chinese city of Tianjin in September 2025. In a speech delivered by Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, he called for the creation of a multilateral currency fund to challenge the dominance of the US dollar and to counter the illegal unilateral sanctions imposed by the US and many European countries against Iran and Russia and other countries. These sanctions violate international law because they do not have the approval of the UN Security Council. And in his speech, the Iranian president insisted that, quote, countries must reduce their dependence on the dollar, end quote, and he proposed the creation of the Initiative of Special Accounts and Clearing within the framework of the SCO in order to strengthen financial cooperation among these Eurasian countries. And the Iranian president, Pezeshkian, said that there should be three main pillars to this new initiative. One, they should expand national financial settlements and reduce reliance on the dollar in economic exchanges. So SCO members should trade with each other and invest in each other's countries with local currencies, their national currencies, not the US dollar. This is something that BRICS has been very much focused on as well. The second pillar is that the SCO should establish a joint digital infrastructure using central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, for secure and transparent payments. And this is another reason why the Donald Trump administration and Wall Street have been lobbying very hard against central bank digital currencies, because they're afraid that if other countries use CBDCs, one, it could be a challenge to the dominance of the US dollar, and two, it could also be a challenge to the dominance of commercial banks, these private banks like on Wall Street. And if retail CBDC accounts are created, if average people could open accounts with their central banks, they wouldn't need to use the private commercial banks, and they could actually be paid much higher interest rates on their saving accounts. Whereas in the US, for instance, the Federal Reserve has the Fed funds rate, the main interest rate, set at 4.33%, and the US central bank pays the private commercial banks a return of 4.33% on their deposits that are held with the central bank. And yet those commercial banks only pay an average interest rate of 0.2% on the savings accounts of average Americans. So if a CBDC account were made available for average people, they would be paid much higher interest rates, which is why Wall Street is also against CBDCs. So again, to summarize, Wall Street is against CBDCs because they could challenge the monopoly that these commercial banks have, and the US government, and the Donald Trump administration in particular, is against CBDCs because it could challenge the global dominance of the US dollar. So that was the second pillar of this proposal. The third pillar of this proposal is to create a multilateral currency fund inside the SCO to support countries exposed to sanctions pressure and also liquidity crises. That means that if countries have a shortage of foreign currencies, they need to pay for imports of energy or food, they can borrow from this SCO organization, this initiative, in another currency in order to pay for their imports of Russian oil, or pay for their imports of Russian wheat, or pay for their imports of Chinese technological products. So I think this is a very realistic proposal inside the SCO that could push for de-dollarization and a more multipolar financial order. And there's clearly interest in this inside the SCO because at this summit, President Xi also proposed the creation of a new development bank, and the SCO members approved the creation of this new development bank at the summit. And on that note, I want to look at the main points that were raised in the joint declaration signed by all of the SCO members at the summit. Now, I'm currently recording on the 2nd of September, and there still is not an official English language translation of this joint declaration. The Chinese government did publish the Chinese version of the statement. So I'm going to be looking at an unofficial English language translation that was done by the Chinese journalist Fred Gao at his website Inside China. So here are the main points of the Tianjin Declaration. Now, the opening paragraph is very powerful. This is what the SCO member said, quote, "The world's political and economic situation and other fields of international relations are undergoing profound historical changes. The international system is evolving toward a more just, equal, and representative multipolar direction opening new prospects for countries' own development and mutually beneficial cooperation. At the same time, geopolitical confrontation is intensifying, posing threats and challenges to the security and stability of the world and the SCO region. The global economy, particularly international trade and financial markets, has suffered severe impacts, end quote. So clearly they're referencing the very aggressive attacks carried out by the US government, and in particular, the use of sanctions, the weaponization of the dollar, and Donald Trump's abuse of tariffs. So what is the SCO's response to this? Well, they say that they, quote, reaffirm their commitment to building a more representative, democratic, and just multipolar world based on the UN Charter and other recognized principles of international law, respect for civilizational diversity, and equal and mutually beneficial cooperation, end quote. Now, they emphasize that the heart of this multipolar world should be the United Nations, and in particular the UN Charter, which is based on non-interference. However, they emphasize that the UN as an organization needs to be significantly reformed because this year is the 80th anniversary. The UN was formed in 1945 at the end of World War II. And when it was formed, the UN Charter originally expressed support for non-interference, opposition to imperialism, and support for anti-colonialism. At that time, much of the world was still colonized formally by the European colonial powers. So originally, when the UN was founded, it was supposed to be a platform for decolonization, for independence, for sovereignty, and for true multipolarity. But what we've seen, especially in the past few decades, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union and in the unipolar era in the 1990s and 2000s, when the US was trying to dominate the entire world, we saw that the UN became less and less democratic and more biased in the interests of the US-led West. This is why the SCO emphasized in this joint declaration that, quote, it is necessary to carry out corresponding reforms of the United Nations to ensure the representation of developing countries in UN governance institutions and adapt the UN to the needs of today's political and economic realities, end quote. And a great example of a UN body that needs significant reform is the Security Council. Now, when US imperial strategists helped to design the UN Security Council at the end of World War II, they gave themselves veto power, and they also gave veto power to the US allies at the time, which were the victors of World War II. Let's not forget that technically on paper, the US was allied with China and with the Soviet Union. This was before the Chinese Revolution in 1949, but this is why the victors, the US, the UK, France, China, and the Soviet Union were all given veto power. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Russia was then given veto power, and the People's Republic of China was finally given its seat at the United Nations in 1971. So today, Russia and China do have veto power, which angers the US, but it's ridiculous that the UK and France have veto power, despite the fact that these are relatively insignificant countries. Each of them has a population of around 70 million people, and yet they have veto power. Meanwhile, India, the most populous country on earth with 1.4 billion people, does not have veto power. And other massive countries like Indonesia and Nigeria and Brazil and Pakistan and Bangladesh, these are countries with hundreds of millions of people, and yet they don't have veto power. And yet that's not all. The bias is even worse when you look at the non-permanent members of the Security Council, because there are 15 seats in total, the 5 permanent members plus 10 non-permanent members, and of those 10, 3 of them are from Europe. So 1/3 of all of the UN Security Council consists of European countries, despite the fact that Europe represents only around 9% of the world population. And then there's the fact that Asia is the most populous continent on Earth. Just Asia represents the majority of the global population, and yet Asia only has 3 seats on the Security Council. That is China, the permanent member, plus 2 non-permanent members from Asia. It is completely ridiculous, and it is out of touch with the reality in the world today. So this is why the SCO is demanding that the UN be reformed to be more representational of developing countries, as they say. And this has been a demand of the Global South, which is the global majority, for many decades, and yet the Western colonial powers have always opposed it for obvious reasons. Okay, so now I'm going to continue looking at the SCO Joint Declaration. At the summit, the SCO members also called to develop a, quote, Charter on Eurasian Diversity and Multipolarity in the 21st Century, end quote, which they say aims to consolidate the development process of the Eurasian continent. By the way, note there how they said Eurasian continent, pointing out that Europe is fake. Europe is not a separate continent. Europe is the western region of the Eurasian continent. Now, continuing in this joint declaration, SCO member states described the new kind of global order that they're trying to create. They're promoting, quote, the construction of a new type of international relations based on mutual respect, fairness and justice, and win-win cooperation, end quote. And in order to build this more multipolar world, the SCO emphasized that international financial institutions also need to be significantly reformed, along with the UN. So in this joint declaration, they called for reforming international financial institutions, in particular the World Bank and the IMF, in order to, quote, increase the representation and voice of developing countries in the management of international financial institutions, end quote. They also called for deepening financial cooperation among themselves. So it's not just about reforming existing institutions, but also creating new ones and strengthening alternative institutions. So for instance, they reiterated their call for expanding the share of local currency settlements among SCO member states. That was originally called for at the summit in 2022, which is important because, as I emphasized earlier, the SCO was originally formed primarily as a security-focused organization, but now it's focused more and more on other issues, including financial and economic integration, and the SCO, like BRICS, is calling for de-dollarization. And in the same vein, this joint declaration reaffirms the importance of establishing an SCO development bank, as was called for by China's President Xi, and they said that they did decide to establish this new development bank. So that's a pretty significant announcement. So those were the main points raised in the joint declaration signed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. Now, before I conclude here today, I also want to look at the highlights of the speech delivered by China's President Xi Jinping. I think this was a very important speech, and it provides a very good view of how in Beijing Chinese political leaders see the world and what Beijing's vision is for a more multipolar world. Now, President Xi initiated this speech emphasizing what he calls the Shanghai spirit, which is based on mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, consultation, respect for diversity of civilizations, and pursuit of common development. So those are the basic principles that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was founded upon. And the Chinese leader pointed out that when the SCO was first formed way back in 2001, originally it was focused on law enforcement and security cooperation, and in particular, combating extremism in the region. However, President Xi has pointed out that the SCO has expanded, and now it encompasses other areas, especially economic cooperation. He pointed out that China's cumulative trade with other SCO countries has surpassed $2.3 trillion worth, although a lot of that is not being done in dollars. It's being done in other currencies. And the physical integration of the Eurasian landmass has massively expanded, and there are now nearly 14,000 kilometers of international land transport routes that are in operation among member states of the SCO. Now, continuing in this speech, The Chinese president emphasized that the SCO could be a model for a more multipolar world that is opposed to imperialism and hegemony. In China, they frequently say hegemonism. They prefer saying that over imperialism. And in this speech, President Xi said, quote, "We always stand on the side of international fairness and justice, champion inclusiveness and mutual learning between civilizations, and oppose hegemonism and power politics, thus becoming a proactive force for world peace and development," end quote. So again, this is something that you constantly hear reiterated in statements made by Chinese political leaders and diplomats. They are opposed to hegemonism and power politics, and also what they call the Cold War mentality. So this is a sign to the US. China is saying, we don't want a new Cold War. We don't want to divide the world up in blocks fighting against each other. We want a multipolar world based on mutually beneficial win-win cooperation. And if the US and the broader West don't want to be part of this process of economic and political integration, then fine, that's their decision. But Eurasia is going to continue moving forward and advancing. So President Xi called for unity. He said, quote, "We should seek common ground while putting aside differences," end quote. He said that they should, quote, "strengthen solidarity and collaboration," end quote. He said they should, quote, "pursue mutual benefits and win-win cooperation," end quote. And he said the goals should be to strengthen the momentum of regional development and improve the well-being of the people, to enhance cooperation in areas like energy, infrastructure, green industry, the digital economy, scientific and technological innovation, and artificial intelligence. This is also very important. In fact, in the speech at the SCO summit, President Xi announced that China is willing to share its AI technology with other countries. They don't want to just have a technological monopoly, which is what US corporations in Silicon Valley want. This is what billionaires like Peter Thiel want. And Thiel is a major funder of the Republican Party and a close ally of Donald Trump. China is saying, no, we are going to share our AI technology with the world. And by the way, a lot of Chinese AI companies have been putting their money where their mouth is, and they have been releasing their AI models for free, open source. So China is saying that this could be a symbol of a more peaceful, multipolar world based on mutually beneficial win-win cooperation. But unfortunately, the US empire opposes this. This is why the Chinese leader emphasized in his speech that we should, quote, oppose the Cold War mentality, block confrontation, and bullying practices, end quote. So that's obviously a reference to the US. He's saying that in Washington, politicians have a Cold War mentality. They're trying to create blocks to confront each other, and they're engaging in bullying, and China opposes that. Instead, President Xi said, quote, we should advocate an equal and orderly multipolar world, end quote. So I think that's the perfect note to end on. You know, ignorant Western pundits constantly claim that we have no idea what kind of global order China wants to create. They claim that China is just going to be another empire, which is completely absurd. This is China's vision for a more multipolar world. China does not want to simply replace the US as a new global hegemon. China does want its interests to be respected, of course. China does demand that other countries do not interfere in its internal affairs and that they treat the country with dignity. But China does not want to be the global leader. China is part of a global movement with other countries in the global south. BRICS represents more broadly the global south as a whole, but the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, represents Eurasia, the largest landmass in the world that has the majority of the global population. And together, they are creating a more multipolar world order, and they're not waiting for the permission of the US-led West. They're telling the US-led West, we are in a post-Western world. You can integrate into the rest of the world and accept the end of your imperialist hegemony, or you can be forgotten as the global majority unites and technologically advances and economically integrates. What we're seeing are two fundamentally different visions of the world. What the US empire wants is to revive its imperialist hegemony, to impose its will on the rest of the planet, and to go back to the 1990s, when everyone just followed the orders from Washington. What the Global South is demanding in organizations like the SCO and BRICS is a more multipolar world in which there is not a hegemonic group of countries that control everyone else. It is a more democratic system in which the formerly colonized countries of the Global South actually have equal representation and an equal say. This is why I think it's very important to closely look at what's happening in these kinds of summits that are held by BRICS, by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Western pundits often arrogantly condemn them as mere talk shops, but they're not talk shops. They are building the new multipolar global order brick by brick, if you will. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I'm going to do a follow-up video talking about the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the massive parade held in China on the 3rd of September. But this video is already long enough, so make sure that you come back to follow our analysis here at Geopolitical Economy Report. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.